I am Meredith, 22 years old, and I was standing on the front porch of my family's house in Tacoma, gripping the handle of my heavy suitcase. It hadn't even been 24 hours since they had ruthlessly thrown me out into the freezing rain, stripping away my home over a pile of vicious fabricated lies. My older sister leaned casually against the wooden doorframe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. A smug, mocking smile stretched across her face as she looked down at my luggage. "Crawling back already?" she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Couldn't even last a single night out there in the real world, huh?" Hearing the commotion, my father marched out from the living room. His posture was rigid, his face hardened with that familiar authoritarian scowl. He didn't ask where I had been. He simply barked his orders. "Since you finally realize how utterly useless you are without my roof over your head, bring your bags inside and head straight to the kitchen. You're cooking dinner tonight. Consider it your punishment for your pathetic display yesterday." I didn't flinch. I didn't shed a single tear. I just stood there in absolute silence, my gaze locked onto theirs, cold and unyielding. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing a single ounce of fear or weakness in my eyes. Suddenly, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the damp air from right behind me. "Step aside now." My grandmother stepped up onto the porch, her presence radiating pure, undeniable authority. Instantly, the arrogant smirk on my sister's face melted into sheer panic, and my father swallowed hard, stepping back in shock. A year before the cracks turned into an unbridgeable chasm, our household in Tacoma was already a suffocating environment built on extreme favoritism. Dad controlled every single aspect of our daily lives, with an iron fist dictating who received support and who was cast aside. My mother, Teresa, lived in a constant state of anxiety under his roof. She chose absolute silence as her primary survival mechanism, actively tiptoeing around his unpredictable, explosive temper. Whenever his unreasonable demands or harsh criticisms fell heavily on my shoulders, Mom would simply lower her head and look away. She never once dared to open her mouth, speak up, or offer even a fraction of a defense for me. Dad constantly complained about our household finances being completely drained, using it as a weapon against me. "The family accounts are completely tapped out right now, so you need to figure it out yourself," Dad would yell across the dinner table whenever the topic of my college expenses was brought up. Because of his relentless claims of imminent poverty, I was forced to take on heavy student loans under my own name. I exhausted myself physically and mentally, juggling 3 different part-time jobs simultaneously. I worked early morning shifts at a local diner, rushed to campus for classes, and managed the late-night desk at the university library, just to independently cover my tuition at the University of Washington. Yet this severe financial crisis miraculously only applied to me. In a baffling and infuriating contradiction, Whitney was continuously showered with expensive luxuries. Dad somehow always found the hidden funds to purchase her a brand new sedan sponsor, her lavish weeks-long vacations to high-end resorts in California, and finance her endless designer shopping sprees. When I finally confronted him about this glaring discrepancy, I stood my ground. "Dad, this isn't fair to either of us," I stated firmly. Dad immediately slammed his fist against the hallway wall. "Stop questioning my financial decisions and focus on your own miserable problems," he shouted, shutting down the conversation entirely. Free from any financial responsibilities, Whitney rarely left the house. Instead, she spent countless hours locked inside her bedroom, glued to her dual computer monitors. She had become highly proficient with complex photo editing software and social media management tools. She dedicated her days to manipulating digital images, altering pixels with expert precision, and curating fake online personas. It was a digital playground she mastered completely, learning exactly how to fabricate reality on a screen with terrifying accuracy. Despite the severe exhaustion of working and studying, I pushed through the adversity and graduated as the valedictorian of my finance program. I walked across the university stage proudly holding my degree, with the highest academic honors. When I brought the framed diploma back to Tacoma, Dad barely even glanced at it. There was no celebratory dinner, no congratulations, not even a simple nod of basic acknowledgement. To him, my hard-earned academic success was completely invisible and entirely irrelevant. The toxic dynamic finally shifted toward outright hostility when reality crashed down on my sister. Whitney remained entirely unemployed, aggressively dodging phone calls from collection agencies as she drowned in mounting credit card debt. Everything changed that Tuesday. I walked into the kitchen holding an official premium sealed job offer letter from a major corporate bank in Seattle. Whitney stared directly at the pristine envelope in my hands. Her eyes narrowed sharply, flashing with a dangerous mix of panic and deep-seated envy. She fully realized that my impending financial independence was about to permanently destroy the unbalanced hierarchy she relied upon. 9 o'clock on that fateful Tuesday night, the atmosphere in the living room turned frigid as Whitney abruptly declared an emergency family meeting. I sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, sensing a calculated malice in her demeanor. Without a single word of warning, she tossed a thick, heavy document folder onto the coffee table with a sharp thud. It contained a meticulously curated collection of digital images and fabricated text exchanges that she had clearly spent several weeks refining behind her computer screen. The documents displayed were nothing short of a vicious smear campaign. The manipulated images featured my face expertly grafted onto scandalous high-resolution photos taken in dim, notorious nightclub settings. The intent was crystal clear: to frame me as a reckless, debauched individual and completely sabotage the corporate background check for my new role at the Seattle bank. Whitney's eyes burned with cold satisfaction as she watched the color drain from my face while I leafed through the pages of lies. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to speak with unwavering clarity. Dad, these things are all being fabricated with malicious intent, and I would never engage in such shameful behavior. I pleaded, my voice trembling with controlled outrage. Before I could even finish my defense, Dad cut me off with a violent motion of his hand. He slammed his palm against the table, his face turning an alarming shade of deep crimson from his explosive, unfiltered rage. Don't you dare lie to my face again. I don't want to hear another word from someone who brings such filth and humiliation upon this house. He roared, standing up and looming over me. In the corner of the room, Mom remained curled up on the sofa, her posture broken and defeated. She kept her face turned toward the wall, her shoulders shaking as she covered her mouth to stifle her sobs. She did not raise a finger to support me. She simply remained in her shell of silence, paralyzed by fear, while watching me being framed for crimes I never committed. Without giving me a chance to retrieve a single possession, Dad grabbed my arm and shoved me toward the front door. He snatched my suitcase from the hallway closet and hurled it onto the porch, where the freezing Tacoma rain was already soaking everything in sight. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a final echoing thud, locking me out into the dark, desolate night. As I stood shivering in the downpour, trying to keep my documents dry, I glanced back at the window. Whitney stood just behind the glass, her phone held steady in her hand. She was recording every desperate move I made, capturing the image of me drenched and broken. Moments later, she hit send, pushing a malicious voice message into our shared social media group, broadcasting her cruel triumph to everyone I knew to ensure my reputation was shattered beyond repair. Midnight arrived, and as a bolt of lightning ripped across the dark sky, I stood shivering on the damp pavement, clutching the soggy folder against my chest. My hands shook uncontrollably as I pulled out my phone and dialed my best friend. Her car pulled up within minutes, the dim headlights cutting through the heavy sheets of rain. Sitting in the passenger seat, she offered a brief, steadying presence, her calm voice helping to anchor my frayed nerves. I didn't say much, but as we drove toward the quiet outskirts of town, the suffocating pressure in my chest finally began to dissipate. She dropped me off directly in front of the house of my grandmother Rosemary. Rosemary answered the door instantly, her eyes scanning my rain-drenched clothes with intense concern. She didn't offer a single word of judgment or pity. Instead, she ushered me inside, wrapped a thick wool blanket around my shoulders, and directed me toward the warmth of the fireplace. Once I had regained a semblance of composure, she sat down across from me. "Tell me exactly what happened," slowly and clearly without leaving anything out. She commanded her tone, brooking no argument. I laid out the sequence of events explaining how the documents were presented and the absolute lack of any chance to defend myself. She donned her reading glasses, the frame catching the firelight, and began to meticulously examine every single page of the smear campaign. Her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized the manipulated images, her finger tracing over inconsistencies that I hadn't even noticed. "Look at the lighting on the walls. And note the license plate in the background of this one, it's completely inconsistent with the time of day." Rosemary pointed out, her voice sharpening with professional precision. Her analytical mind dissected the fabrications layer by layer, exposing the clumsy craftsmanship beneath the deceptive facade. Without pausing, Rosemary grabbed her smartphone and photographed every single piece of evidence from the folder. She typed out a succinct, urgent email to a contact from her past, a veteran expert in digital forensics, who currently served as a lead analyst for the state of Washington. She pressed send with a firm tap. "This is going to require professional validation, but the signs of tampering are already glaringly obvious to me," she stated, her expression settling into a look of resolute determination. Seeing the raw exhaustion written across my face, she reached out and rested a steadying hand on my arm. "We are going to wait for the official forensic results to arrive tomorrow morning, so stop worrying and go get some rest. No one has the right to trample on you like this," she said, her voice filled with a rare, fierce, protective warmth. I was beyond drained, my body trembling with the aftershocks of the night's trauma. I collapsed onto the guest room bed, finally surrendering to the crushing fatigue, while Rosemary remained seated in the living room, a solitary sentinel in the quiet house, waiting patiently for the response that would decide my future. At the break of dawn the following morning, the printer in the study began churning out documents with a rhythmic, unrelenting hum. I sat at the breakfast table, my hands cradling a hot mug of coffee, as Rosemary slid a stack of financial reports toward me. She looked me directly in the eye and asked about the specific status of my student loans. When I explained the burden of debt I had carried throughout my college years, her expression hardened. She revealed a devastating truth: for the past 4 years, she had been faithfully transferring $2,000 every single month directly into Dad's personal account, specifically designated to cover my tuition and housing costs. Rosemary pulled up the bank statements on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys with icy efficiency. We traced the flow of those transfers and found a damning pattern. Every single dollar had been systematically rerouted by Dad, funneled away from my education and straight into Whitney's personal credit card accounts, effectively bankrolling her lavish lifestyle and designer purchases. I stared at the numbers in disbelief, the realization of his betrayal hitting me like a physical blow. Diving deeper into his private email archives, Rosemary uncovered a secondary layer of deception. She found dozens of email threads where Dad had craftily assumed my identity, writing to her under my name, begging for emergency supplemental funds for books and health insurance. It was a cold-blooded, multi-year scheme built entirely on forgery and manipulation. I felt my composure fracture as I looked at her, my voice barely a whisper. "Why on earth would Dad go to such lengths using my identity to steal money from you for all these years?" I asked, trembling. Rosemary didn't hesitate, her answer sharp and final: "Because their greed is bottomless and they have no moral compass whatsoever." As I grappled with the depth of his fraud, Rosemary leaned back and revealed a final strategic secret. "The house where your father and sister live in Tacoma," she began, "is entirely under my legal ownership. Your father has been living there for years, solely because I allowed him to stay completely rent-free. This revelation transformed the entire power dynamic of our situation. Suddenly, an email notification chimed on her laptop, the response from the digital forensics expert. Rosemary opened the report, her face brightening with grim satisfaction. The official document provided conclusive evidence that the smear campaign folder was generated using software on a computer linked directly to the IP address of my father's house. Furthermore, it confirmed that the incriminating images were heavily digitally altered and manipulated beyond any doubt. The evidence was absolute, and the web of lies Dad and Whitney had spun was finally irrevocably collapsing around them. 8 o'clock in the morning, the early sunlight had not yet managed to warm the crisp air when my lawyer Philip arrived at Rosemary's doorstep. He moved with a sense of urgent professional calm, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that contained our entire roadmap to justice. Rosemary sat at the dining table, her posture rigid as she laid out the comprehensive collection of evidence. The financial audit reports the official forensic findings confirming the manipulated photos and the original property deeds, proving her sole legal ownership of the house in Tacoma. Philip immediately began cross-referencing the evidence. Through his discreet inquiries within our shared social circle, he had successfully retrieved a critical piece of digital intelligence, an archived voice message. In the recording, Whitney's voice was unmistakable, arrogant, and mocking as she boasted to her friends about the exact software tools she had utilized to orchestrate my frame-up. It was a digital confession that perfectly bridged the gap between suspicion and undeniable legal fact. With the evidence verified, Rosemary took immediate decisive action regarding their access to her capital. She placed a direct call to her private wealth management bank, authorizing the emergency cancellation of all authorized user privileges. As the banker processed the request, the credit cards assigned to Dad and Mom were instantly deactivated. They were now completely cut off from every single financial lifeline they had been exploiting for years. The next phase of the plan involved securing the physical assets that were being misused. Philip drafted a formal legally binding notice for the immediate recovery of the luxury SUV that Whitney drove daily. Since the vehicle title was registered solely in Rosemary's name, the legal mandate was absolute. Any attempt by Whitney to retain possession of the car after receiving this notice would escalate her situation from simple deception to grand theft auto. Rosemary turned to Philip, her gaze sharp enough to cut through the quiet tension of the room. "Philip, prepare every shred of the legal documentation. I want these fraudsters backed into a corner where they have absolutely nowhere left to hide." She commanded, her voice steady and implacable. Her resolve was absolute, driven by the need to restore the integrity that they had spent years trying to dismantle. Philip methodically sorted the thick stacks of paperwork into his briefcase, his movements precise and disciplined. He looked up, offering a professional nod of confirmation. Every single legal document, from the cease and desist orders to the property eviction notices, was perfectly organized and ready to be served. Everything was set for the direct confrontation that would finally force them to account for every lie, every stolen dollar, and every attempt to destroy my life, all without us having to lift a finger in physical retaliation. At exactly 1 o'clock, the Cadillac pulled to a stop in front of the house. I walked up to the entrance, braced for the final confrontation. Dad stood in the doorway, blocking my path, holding a single document. He forced a pen into my hand, his eyes cold. "Sign this formal waiver declining the job offer in Seattle immediately, or don't even think about stepping foot inside to collect your belongings." He threatened, his voice harsh with ultimatum. Before I could respond, the front door swung wide open, revealing Rosemary and Philip. Rosemary stepped forward with a composed, lethal grace, tossing a thick folder onto the coffee table. It contained the complete financial audit and the digital forensic report, confirming the manipulation of my reputation. Philip followed, his presence commanding the entire room. He pulled out his phone and played the recorded voice message where Whitney gloated about her digital sabotage. The smug, triumphant expression on Whitney's face instantly vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer pale terror as her entire scheme was laid bare. Philip's voice cut through the heavy silence, sharp and authoritative. These documented actions constitute clear cases of fraud, identity theft, defamation, and forgery under the statutes of Washington state law, he declared. The room seemed to shrink. Mom began to sob uncontrollably, her hands covering her face in panic as she realized the legal abyss they had dug for themselves. Dad stood frozen, his face drained of color, stripped of his usual bluster and authoritarian control. He looked small, unable to articulate a single defense against the cold, hard reality of the evidence we had presented. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, the final resolution took hold. Rosemary stood in the center of the room and delivered the ultimatum. You have two choices: either vacate this house by nightfall, or Philip will file the formal criminal and civil complaint with the Washington State Court immediately. Faced with the terrifying prospect of prison time and the total loss of their financial autonomy, the three of them looked utterly defeated. They scrambled to pack their meager belongings into suitcases, leaving behind the symbols of the life they had built on deception, and exited the house in silent, utter humiliation. Once the door clicked shut behind them, the house felt entirely different, tranquil and reclaimed. Rosemary pulled a document from Philip's briefcase and signed it, officially transferring the deed of the Tacoma property to my name, ensuring I finally had a secure foundation to call my own. I walked out onto the front porch, the keys to the front door feeling heavy and solid in my palm. I pulled out my phone, blocked every single one of their numbers, and finally allowed myself to breathe. My life was no longer defined by their manipulation. Tomorrow I would walk into the bank in Seattle as a professional, not a victim, and begin the life I had earned on my own merits. Lessons learned. Greed and toxic favoritism are self-destructive forces that inevitably demand a steep price. When narcissistic individuals utilize deceit to exploit their own blood objectivity, and the rule of law remain the most effective tools for dismantling their power. No hollow facade of authority can ever truly mask the criminality of property theft and systemic manipulation. Justice may be quiet, but it is absolute. Thank you so much for joining me on this intense journey toward justice. I am truly grateful for your support in reaching the end of this story. I would love to hear your thoughts on my grandmother's decisive, legally backed approach to handling this situation. Please share your reflections in the comments below.